Former 7th Cavalryman Theodor W. Golden has a secret. His eyewitness narrative is a unique gem because he was among the last men to see General Custer alive. We'll look at his letter from 1904 in which he told his story. But before we start, please support our community by liking and subscribing to our channel. Your letters from July 28th and August 2nd, asking for a few anecdotes of my own experiences and knowledge of General Custer's last combat, have been received. My memories may have been somewhat clouded by the years that have passed since that significant occurrence, and the limited amount of time I have available calls for a fragmentary account. I have read your articles on this topic and the entire series with great interest, and I am very happy to hear that they will soon be published as books. To answer your question, I will say that I had the honor of getting to know General Custer from the time I joined the regiment in 1873 until his tragic death. Except for 1875, when my troop was stationed in the southern states, I fought alongside him and the regiment. We learned of a planned campaign against the Sioux in the early spring of 1876, which would include 3 sizable columns. After receiving moving orders a few weeks later, our regiment moved from the area around Shreveport, Louisiana, to Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory. General Custer joined the regiment several days before our column left and was appearing before an investigating committee in Washington when we arrived. I won't go into detail about our march from Fort Lincoln to the Yellowstone, which we arrived at close to the Powder River's mouth, because I was arrested in Chicago while traveling from Washington. It was agreed to forego our wagons and set up a supply camp, so we stayed there for a few days, outfitting our packed train. A few days earlier, Major Reno had left on a scouting expedition with the intention of returning to us on June 17th, close to the mouth of the Tongue River. Following preparations to depart from our regimental band, dismounted recruits, and wagon train at Powder River. On June 17th, the day General Crook fought the Indians in a bloody battle on the Rosebud, we moved to the mouth of the Tongue River and set up camp. We kept a close eye on every far-off dust cloud that moved across the riverbed during the day, in the hopes that it would indicate Major Reno's command was approaching. But since he had not contacted us, we set up camp early on the 18th and moved up the valley, eventually catching up to Reno just after midday. General Custer's attitude had obviously altered. In contrast to his normal demeanor, he seemed irritable, moody, and somewhat anxious. General Custer changed with the arrival of Major Reno with his report. He quickly rallied the command into marching order and headed toward the Rosebud, where General Terry had already gone ahead of us aboard the supply steamer Far West in the hopes of joining General Gibbon's command. His usual zeal and decisiveness were on display. We marched late into the night, knowing that the steamer was nearby, but we finally arrived at the Yellowstone and set up camp, confident that we would catch it if it was really below us. We left early the following morning and soon saw the Far West ship in General Gibbon's wagon column ascending the river. To notify them of Reno's finding of an important Indian trail, couriers were sent out. Soon after, we set up camp close to the Rosebud's mouth, where a council of war was called to thoroughly examine Reno's report. Preparations were prepared for an aggressive campaign the next day. I seem to remember that on the evening of the 21st, a last conference was conducted aboard the steamer, where General Custer was given his final orders, which were essentially what you mentioned. When asked when he could arrive at the mouth of the Little Bighorn River during the council's adjournment, General Gibbon responded that he couldn't until noon on the 26th. According to reports at this conference, General Custer had been offered the 2nd Cavalry Battalion and Artillery, which had been shipped on the steamer. However, he turned down both offers, stating that he trusted his command's skills and was worried that the artillery would impede their advance when the enemy was close. As he had become used to in earlier years, many officers and troops felt that this was a part of a prearranged scheme to obtain an autonomous command. However, his request was approved. We paraded in front of Generals Terry and Gibbon on the afternoon of June 22nd, and then we started along the path Major Reno had outlined. We followed the trail from that point until Reno came across the Indian village, only straying to find appropriate camping areas. No attempt was made to send a courier to General Gibbon or scout the surrounding area in violation of our orders. Our marches were long and swift until the evening of the 24th, when we appeared to be settling in for the night after veering off the track, even though we had a scout, George Herendeen, assigned to our command for that purpose. We had been told to stay mounted and ready for a night march, so this was only a ploy to trick the Indians. General Custer's attitude changed as soon as we left the Rosebud. His once restless energy reappeared, and he appeared to be entirely focused on getting to and interacting with the Indians. It is important to remember that the trail we followed led from the Missouri River, and based on bloody knives and our Crow Scouts' estimations, showed a band of between 1,000 and 1,200 Indians. We later learned that these Indians were from the Missouri River agencies and were almost exclusively warriors. At approximately 11 o'clock, we were told to mount and wait in line. A scouting group made up of Crows, Reese, and a few of our officers, notably Lieutenants Varnum and Hare, had pushed forward in the meantime to examine the path across the split and make an effort to find the Indians. We left our bivouac and continued following the path in an attempt to cross the divide and reach the Little Bighorn foothills for cover before daybreak the next day. But our progress was hampered by the rough terrain and the challenge of scouting the trail, and daybreak discovered us in a gully at the foot of a series of high bluffs, unsure of how far we were from the river. General Custer was said to have moved forward to join the scouts throughout the night, and just after daybreak, they told him that they had found the settlement in the Little Bighorn Valley. General Custer reportedly voiced suspicion and doubted their story nevertheless. When a detachment going to retrieve a misplaced box of ammunition, which turned out to contain hardtack, came upon Indians trying to open it, it became clear that our presence in the area had been detected. General Custer appeared to settle on a rapid advance after receiving this report. However, when the command was being divided, half-breed Crow interpreter Mitch Bowie warned General Custer that he would encounter more Indians in the valley than he could manage under his command. In response to General Custer's question about whether he was scared to move further, Bowie said he would go with Custer wherever he went, but cautioned that neither of them would survive if they entered the valley. Lieutenant McIntosh instructed me to report to General Custer for duty as an orderly just before the advance, and I did so right away. The general gave me instructions to ride with our regimental adjutant, Lieutenant Cook, and carry out any duties he gave me. The men had fallen to the ground during our brief stop, the most of them dozing, and the horses were grazing in the sagebrush. The company and each battalion that was first prepared were to take the right of the line, according to General Custer's command for the advance. We were all mounted and prepared in a matter of minutes. Benton's battalion was instructed to advance to the left during the pause in order to scout the area, push any Indians out of his way, and report any discoveries to the headquarters. General Custer, commanding 5 soldiers, broke off to the right, leaving McDougal with the pack train to do the best he could follow the trail, while Reno was to follow it. As soon as these commands were given, we moved into the line of march. The challenging terrain prompted General Custer's column to divert left after a grueling half-hour ride, and we soon encountered Major Reno's command, which was moving forward on the trail as quickly as the rocky ascent allowed. After a long ascent, we arrived at the summit of the ridge and saw a level plateau that sloped toward the river's foothills, which were perhaps 5 or 6 kilometers away. While Benteen's command was visible miles to our left, scouting the bluffs as directed, we could see Reno's column in the distance, moving quickly down the route as our command reached the gap. Although we were far away and to his right, we generally followed Reno's path. Custer would occasionally charge ahead, then slow down and wait for us to approach before rushing off again, giving the impression to those of us close to him that he was becoming impatient with our speed. Although its nature was unknown to us, we imagined a huge dust cloud traveling down the river valley at this point. Custer rode toward the river with just his ordered trumpeter by his side. He stopped atop a tall peak, where we observed him lift his hat as if to greet someone far away. Then, under the leadership of Captain Keogh and I Troop, who had fought in many engagements, he went back to the front of the column. "Those Indians are running," Custer said to Keogh, his eyes bright. "We can afford to sacrifice half of the command's horses if we can continue the chase." Keogh turned in his saddle, looking out at the long line of excited faces with the composure of a dress parade, and said, "General, we shall do all that man and horse can do." The first charge we had heard since leaving the Rosebud was blared by the bugles a few moments later, and we thundered north down the river in an unsuccessful attempt to drop into the valley below. General Custer spoke with Captain Keogh, briefly following what may have been the third failed attempt to descend into the valley. Captain Keogh quickly wrote a note on his pad, folded it, and summoned an orderly. Since I was the first to reply, Kyo gave me the paper containing the directive. Give this to Major Reno, stay with him until we reach a junction, and then immediately report back to me. Then he disappeared. The back of the column roared past me and disappeared into the gorges a moment later. I stared after them for a time before realizing I was in hostile terrain by myself. I hurried to Reno's order, which I found by looking at the dust cloud that was hanging above them. Luckily, I didn't experience much harassment. Just a few long-range rounds were fired at me, which further motivated me. Reno was dismounting to fight the enemy on foot when I caught up to him after a 6-mile ride. I sent my message without knowing what it contained. After giving it a quick glance, Reno pocketed it. The rescouts panicked at this point and ran away, continuing until they arrived at the Powder River and the wagon train's safety. The Indians were shortly seen to be circling us and encroaching from behind. Several horses were shot and a few stampeded as we had to turn and try to fend off their approaches until we reached the timber. After a while, we moved back into the woods, where we had greater cover, and we started fighting again. For a little period, we were able to mount a more successful defense because of the timber and riverbank. A moment later, we saw Captain Moylan getting his men ready for battle. Standing close by on the skirmish line, Lieutenant Wallace yelled out to Captain French, who was in charge of the center company, asking what the instructions were. French responded that he had not received any, but he will try to find out. Shortly after, he yelled at us that, despite not having specific directions, he knew a charge was coming. He proposed that we get on horseback and back the charge. About 15 of our men were dismounted as we were getting ready to mount, either as a result of the heavy gunfire or the stampeding of their horses. As we swung into the saddle, Trooper McCormick resignedly commented that we were all doomed anyway, and that he would as well die on foot as on horseback, because Lieutenant McIntosh had lost his horse. We were shocked to discover it as we came out of the woods. Reno was making a deft charge on the bluffs across the river from the Indians, instead of charging them. The Indians gathered on our sides and opened fire on our fleeing column after discovering this. Thankfully, their shooting was subpar, and at this point in the retreat, which had turned into a frantic stampede, we suffered only minor casualties. According to reports, Reno got so excited that he shot the Indians with his handgun until it was empty and threw the weapon away. I can confirm, nevertheless, that this report is untrue because General Benteen or his family now owns the revolver in question, or they did a few years ago. I was riding close to the timber on the left flank of our column during the retreat when my horse unexpectedly crashed, sending me flying into a patch of sagebrush. Fortunately, I received only minor injuries, largely to my outer appearance. Lieutenant Wallace rode by me as I clambered to my feet, telling me to flee for the timber since my horse had been dead. Instead of stopping to confirm his information, I followed his suggestion and hurried toward the timber, pausing only a few times before arriving at it from my hidden location shortly after. I saw our men forcing our horses to cross the boulder-strewn stream by pushing them into the river. Lieutenant Hodgson appeared to be hurt as I watched his horse jump into the water. After successfully escaping the stirrups, he grabbed a passing trooper's stirrup strap and used it to help him cross. When he arrived at the bank, it was evident that he was indeed hurt, yet he bravely persisted. The trooper tried to help him get into the saddle, but he was afraid to stop his horse. Hodgson appeared to be hit once more in the following second, losing his grip and collapsing to the ground. He stumbled to his feet and asked a fellow soldier for assistance, who restrained him. The second trooper put up his arms, swayed in the saddle, and fell heavily to the ground just as it appeared that he was spared. Hodgson struggled ahead a few paces before tripping again, trying to find his way to the gully up which the command was vanishing. He turned to face the Indians, pulled out his revolver, and started shooting after apparently understanding that retreating any farther would be pointless. As our guys managed to cross the river and climb a nearby ravine, 3 or 4 shots sounded out from my side of the river a moment later, and I watched Hodgson reel and fall, knowing his fate was set. I was by myself, contemplating my own destiny. However, while the Indians were busy stripping and disfiguring the remains of our fallen friends along the riverbank, I went unobserved and unmolested. I assumed Custer was fighting the enemy at this moment after hearing distant sounds of heavy firing downriver. I was afraid that he was as greatly outnumbered as we had been, based on my brief observations of the area. The majority of the Indians in our area abruptly scattered, hurrying to join their fellows at the village's lower end. I yelled out to George Herendeen, the scout, when I saw him close by. He told me that the 15 dismounted guys from our group had arrived at a spot in the woods, roughly 200 yards distant, when we were rejoined shortly after. However, they encountered Indian fire when they tried to traverse the open area to approach the river. The Indians had burned the riverbed before leaving, perhaps to hide their activities or to smoke out our injured. We were able to reach the river safely thanks to this smoke, which turned out to be our rescue. After crossing the river with some difficulty, we came across one of our Crow scouts, who guided us to our command, where we quickly reconnected. Benteen's battalion had arrived when we joined the command, but there was no word on Custer's whereabouts. A white flag was seen waving from the river bottom, not far from where Herendeen and I had sought cover after we had finished recounting what we had seen. Lieutenant Hare courageously put his life in danger to crawl to a viewpoint on the cliffs and let the group below know that we were friendly forces. They entered our lines after carefully crossing the river, identifying themselves as the dismounted men who had been abandoned during Reno's retreat. During the confusion of our withdrawal, I had seen Lieutenant McIntosh galloping several rods ahead of me on McCormick's horse. The picket pins were hitting sagebrush and other obstructions as his lariat came loose and was trailing on the ground, posing a risk. He appeared to ignore the cautions of several men who tried to warn him of this danger. His horse fell a few moments later, and I was unable to determine if he had been shot. The lieutenant was laying still as I went by, perhaps dazed or dead. The next day, when the Indians had left, we discovered him in the same spot, and it seemed that he had truly met his demise. I heard a furious argument nearby as I stood on the cliffs and looked down into the valley. "By God," said Captain Ware, "I'll go if you won't, and someone will be held accountable if we manage to get out of this situation." After he strode off, I watched D Troop get up and move into the valley in the direction of the far-off firing. With the exception of Benteen's and Godfrey's troops, who upheld a semblance of military order, the entire command obeyed without any clear orders. We continued down the valley till we came upon Weir's company, retreating due to an overwhelming Indian force. We quickly organized into a line, preventing the oncoming mob from moving forward until Weir's order had crossed our lines and regrouped behind us. We were able to recover and reorganize with their assistance. Colonel Benteen, who appeared to have taken charge of our area, turned to Lieutenant Wallace as we were retreating and told him, "William, there's no use falling back further. With your right flank anchored here, gather your troops and we'll take a position." Wallace said with a wry smirk, "I have 2 men, not a troop." Benning said, "Form yourself and your 2 men, and I'll let you know our situation once I've determined it myself," with a grim laugh. The core of our defensive line was made up of this small group. Soon after, other people joined us, and we quickly built impromptu barricades and started shooting while we sought cover behind sagebrush. Until midnight, when the darkness offered a much-needed reprieve, we were able to hold the Indians at bay. We repositioned ourselves, set up a hospital and corral, and firmly established ourselves over the night. The action resumed at daylight and went on without interruption until around 3 in the afternoon, when the Indians suddenly started packing their travois, dismantling their teepees, and leaving up the river valley, unfortunately out of rifle range. Volunteer groups went outside to get water twice in the afternoon, both times encountering Indian fire. Sadly, Madden of K Troop suffered severe leg injuries that necessitated amputation after being hit during the second excursion. After we took him to the hospital, his leg was amputated that evening. General Terry and General Gibbons showed up the next day with news of our brother's fate in the other battalion and relief. After bringing our injured across the river, we went to the battlefield on the 28th and buried Custer's men's remains. We discovered very few bodies that had not undergone some kind of mutilation, with the exception of General Custer himself. However, from what I remember, there were no such marks on the body of our slain leader. Since there isn't much room, I won't go into depth about individual occurrences or the combat, because your piece has already covered such topics well enough. After speaking with a number of Army officers and frontier veterans, it was agreed that this disaster was caused by 3 main elements. First off, there was a serious lack of support among our forces as a result of our command being split up into 4 distinct columns, each around 15 miles from the combat, without accurate information about the enemy's strength or whereabouts. Second, it was negative that Custer arrived on the scene about 24 hours early. Thirdly, the efficacy of our command was significantly hampered by the loss of horses and extra ammunition. Since this topic has already been thoroughly studied by more knowledgeable people, I won't go into greater detail. I came away from my encounters with General Custer with the impression that he was recklessly brave and prone to taking chances without carefully considering the hazards. I've always thought that his acute awareness of the perceived shame brought on by the president's treatment of him could be one explanation for his conduct, even in spite of the orders he received. It is possible that he aimed to restore his reputation as a leading Indian fighter and leader in the public's eyes by achieving a bold and definitive win, reminiscent of his victory at Washita. Regardless of his reason, we must all agree that he fought valiantly and ultimately gave his life in defense of his fellow riders who had helped him win many fights before. With all sincerity, Theo. West Golden. I hope this first-hand story helps you see the Battle of Little Bighorn and the 1876 Great Sioux War from a different angle. Watch this space for more videos. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. I want to bring you more first-hand experiences of other fights,